teaching today. Well, I want to welcome you. Thank you for being here. We are starting a new series today called Big Dreams. We're going to do an overview. We're going to be looking at the life of Joseph in the Old Testament. And so if you will, turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 37. We're only going to be reading 4 verses, and so we've got a lot to talk about in 4 verses. Genesis chapter 37. If you are a guest here with us, I'm so thankful that you are here. Let us know how we can serve you best. We want you to feel at home here. You know, Mark Twain once said, there are 2 great days in a person's life: the day that we are born and the day we discover why. One day is easier than the other. One is a date in time. It's a moment that you celebrate every year. It's the date when you made your first public appearance, if you will, right? That date is easy, but the other one isn't. The moment that you discover why God has put you where you are is an overwhelming thing. And if you look at the life of Joseph, what you find is it took Joseph a while to get to the point, to get to the place where he recognized God's purpose in his life. He endured a lot of trials. He started from a very difficult place. And in the book of Genesis, what we find is there are really main characters who illustrate how our faith functions in our relationship with God. And Abraham obviously is the big character of the book of Genesis. But what's interesting, a couple things I want to point out about Joseph is, number one, is Joseph's story is the longest story in Genesis. The most attention goes to Joseph when you look at the length of everything that is laid out starting in Genesis chapter 37. And the second thing that I want you to remember as we move through this series is that the life of Joseph is really the greatest and the clearest picture of Jesus Christ in all of the Old Testament. Joseph resonates with the story of Christ, and there's so much connection. He is a foreshadow, if you will, of Jesus. And you look at all the connections between Joseph's life and Jesus' life. Both of them were innocent. Both of them were both chosen and beloved by their father. They were both sent from their fathers to see about their brothers. They were both sold as slaves. And like Jesus, Joseph was cast between 2 criminals when he was in the prison. Joseph forgave those who tried to ruin his life, just as Jesus did, and on it goes. And we will be drawing out some of those foreshadowings, if you will, throughout the series. But to start out today, and the title of the sermon today is this: Overcoming Where You Come From. Overcoming where you come from. Joseph's life started out with, I guess the easiest way to say it is, a very difficult family dynamic. Very interesting family dynamic. We'll talk about that here in a minute. I want to start out right now with this illustration. Let me read you this story. July 19th, 1989, Flight 232 was headed to Philadelphia, and the flight was going perfect. Everything is exactly as it should be. Exactly 1 hour and 7 minutes after takeoff, the number 2 engine, which was mounted high on the tail of the plane, suddenly exploded. The flight panel immediately showed that the engine had failed and the hydraulic system was ceasing to function. And normally that wouldn't be a concern to the captain of that plane because it's equipped with 3 different hydraulic systems so that if one fails, the other 2 will continue so the plane won't be disabled. And so, in truth, over the entire plane, there was one spot of vulnerability on this plane. And it was a spot where all 3 of these independent hydraulic systems would meet together at a 4 square foot spot on the back of the plane. This was the main thing. As long as that held together, there really wouldn't be that much of an issue. The odds of anything going wrong were calculated at 1 to 10 to the 23rd power, or 1 billion to 1. So it's not likely that it's going to happen. Unfortunately, the odds were against those who were on board of Flight 232. At 3:09 p.m., the pilot and crew experienced a total hydraulic failure. Nothing functioned. Controlling the plane became an absolute nightmare. The brakes were not working. The on-ground steering wasn't working. If they even managed to land, they had no idea how they could bring the plane to a stop. Over the course of several minutes, the captain and the crew, as they, in a panic, addressed what they could. They got the plane to slightly turn to the right, and what they did is they turned towards a very small airport in Sioux City, Iowa, and they managed to float the plane down and to get it to the place where they could touch down. And when it was all over, the plane ended up hitting the ground and rolling, and 111 people died in that plane crash. And what they found in the studies afterwards is they began to investigate the disaster, and they found a fan disc in engine number 2, which exploded. When it happened, it sent shrapnel into that 4-foot section of the back of the plane. But they didn't stop there in their investigation. What they found is because these discs were so specialized that they found that they could trace the paper trail all the way back to a piece of titanium during the forging process of the discs, and they found that this was the reason that everything went wrong. When the parts for this specific jet aircraft are forged, the molten titanium is subjected to extreme force and pressure. 50,000 tons of pressure is exerted on this liquid metal to try to get any traces of gas bubbles that might be trapped inside to get them out for safety. And in the report, what they found was that there was left a tiny amount of nitrogen in this particular piece of titanium, microscopic pockets. It took 15,503 takeoff and landing cycles before this became an issue. But when it became an issue, it was a deadly issue. So what's the point of the story? What's the moral of the story? And here it is. Even the smallest flaw in the formative stages can lead to disaster later. How many times has this played out in families today? Over the last few decades, we've learned a new word, and this word is dysfunctional. Flawed parents act out in emotion while raising children, but it doesn't end there. Dysfunctional families, a child grows up and repeats the patterns and the processes that they learned from mom and dad. Each generation adding one more link to a growing chain of pain and brokenness that seems unbreakable, and it will remain unbreakable until someone recognizes the problem, deliberately rejects the examples that have been played out before them in their life, turns their eyes to the Lord. It's hard to live for God and do what is right in a dysfunctional family. It's not impossible. And this is the focus of our study this morning. And let's look at these insights from the life of Joseph in Genesis chapter 37 and verse 1. Read with me. And Jacob dwelt in the land wherein his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and with the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought unto his father their evil report. Now, a special note that I marked in my Bible right there when it says that Joseph brought his father an evil report of his brothers, and I encourage you to write it. Snitches get stitches, right? Add that into the side. Verse 3, now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him, and they could not speak peaceably unto him. The Bible here in chapter 37 cuts to the chase quickly in depicting a family with some serious tension. Joseph is from a dysfunctional family. Now, if you remember the story, and I'm sure you do, Joseph was the first of two sons from his mother Rachel. Rachel was the wife that Jacob loved the most. Rachel was the wife that Jacob longed for the most. If you remember, you go all the way back, Jacob works for Rachel's father And Jacob is tricked, after 7 years of work, he's tricked into marrying Rachel's sister, Leah. Not to be derogatory, but we call her lazy-eyed Leah, right? She didn't look like Rachel. How Jacob didn't recognize the issue is a question in and of itself. And so Jacob marries Leah, works for 7 more years, and is given Rachel from her father so he can marry her. Rachel was barren. She was unable to have children for years. In fact, Leah had multiple sons before God granted Rachel her first child. And so Joseph is the favorite of Jacob because he is the first son of Rachel. And so Joseph, let's get a picture of this dysfunctional family. Joseph is the 11th of 12 brothers. His father is Jacob, his mother is Rachel. And so as this story opens, Rachel has died, giving birth to the last son, Benjamin. Rachel was Jacob, his father's favorite wife, but we know that he was also married to Rachel's sister. Both wives gave one of their servants to Jacob to be the mother for 4 children. So you've got 4 wives in total, 13 children in total. Rachel had wanted children for many years, and she stood by and she watched as the other wives were giving children to Jacob, yet she was Jacob's favorite. I think it's safe to assume there was probably a spirit of jealousy in the air. So let's break it down. Joseph's family was unbelievable. I mean, this is a soap opera, right? I mean, if there is one. I know some of y'all watch them, right? I know you do. Weekday mornings, right? Nothing on TV but a soap opera. Well, read this. It's the same thing, right? And so you can hardly believe it. Joseph had 3 stepmothers, 10 stepbrothers, 1 brother, and a stepsister, all living in the home at the same time. His father, Jacob, though generally Jacob was a godly man, he embraced the polygamy of the day that was very common. This opened the door not only to jealousy, but certainly to insecurity and constant conflict amongst the wives. Jacob was a passive parent. He often lacked involvement and leadership, and because of that, he brought pain and confusion into his family, and especially to his children. Joseph's brothers, they took turns being conniving and really openly immoral. This is not a good situation. This would make for great TV, but it's kind of a heartbreaking reality that plays out in many of our lives. Amid the fighting in the family and the blatant sin, we have examples of emotional manipulation. But for Joseph, leading up to chapter 37, there's some important things that happened in his life that I want to point out before we get into the applicational aspect of this. In Genesis chapter 32, it reports a time that Jacob, he divided his family in flocks and he sent them ahead without him. If you remember the story, Joseph as a young boy, this was no doubt a frightening time. Dad is staying back by a river, being ready to be confronted because he has heard that his brother Esau has 400 soldiers and he's coming to kill Jacob. Jacob sends his children, young Joseph and others, ahead of him and stays behind, and we know how the story played out, but that no doubt that played a profound impact on a young boy of Joseph's age. The second thing that happened in Joseph's life was that his mother died. While giving birth to Benjamin, Rachel passed away, and obviously this would have brought a huge sense of a fragile emotional reaction to his mother passing away. The third blow to the family came when Isaac, Joseph's grandpa, died and was buried where Abraham, Sarah, and Rebekah had been buried. The unique role that Isaac, think of Isaac, Abraham's son, Joseph's grandfather, the unique role that Isaac played as Joseph was being brought up. Joseph's current family was a dysfunctional mess, and those who had gone before him walked with the Lord. There's some tension in that. And so these moments, combined with the lessons that Joseph picked up in his early years, allowed him to see the Lord in a different way. And here's my question for you. How many of you today need to overcome where you've come from? We often look back in our lives, and let's be real today, that some of us have endured abuse. We have endured brokenness. We've watched families break apart. Some of us have endured these things in a very real way that has really marked the way that we live our lives. It's played a huge impact into our reaction about who God is and what God wants to do in my life. Would you say that that's an accurate statement? We live in a world that is full of dysfunction, and let's be honest, is there a family that is not dysfunctional in some way? No, there's really not. Many families keep the craziness a secret, right? Nobody knows, but it's there, right? Some families, they just, hey, it's on full display. This is the way we live our life, right? Everybody's going to know. There is always hope for the craziness in our lives because God is the God who overcomes. How can we, like Joseph, overcome the place that we come from, the place that we started? Joseph being raised in a dysfunctional home of mothers and three stepmothers, and his mother dying when he was young, his father, Jacob. I mean, if you're unfamiliar with what the name Jacob means, it means liar or deceiver. And we know that Jacob started off this whole thing by lying and deceiving. But the truth is, we all come from a mixed bag. Jacob had a devious streak, but he was an amazing man of faith. So how do we, like Joseph, overcome difficult starts? And what we'll find as we move into the series next week, we begin to unpack and unplug some of the things that Joseph begins to endure and what God was doing in them. But today, Joseph had to eventually make the decision that regardless of where I come from, regardless of the brokenness and the lying and the cheating and the abuse and the fact that my brothers tried to kill me, which, right? Regardless of all the things I've moved through, Joseph had to make the decision at some point. I will trust the Lord. He had to make the decision that what God is doing in my life is for His glory, and that God can use anything I endure, and He can use it for good in my life. That is an amazing thought. How do we overcome? How can we overcome our past and the things that we have endured? How can we overcome where we have come from? How can I overcome a difficult beginning in my life without being a victim who replays the same thing over and over in my family? How can I, as a parent, stop relaying the same words and the same actions and experiences that I had when I grew up with my children? Here's a few suggestions from the life of Joseph to kick off this series. Number one, how do we do this? First of all, we have to acknowledge God's sovereignty. Hello. Acknowledge God's sovereignty. Joseph believed in one simple truth. And it's a truth that we need to understand and believe in. God is always in control. Is there ever a moment in your life where it got outside of God's control? Where God was unaware, where God was incapable, where God was powerless to speak into your situation? We often think that if things are bad, God has lost control because God would only want the best. But let me tell you something. Joseph never would have been where he was at the end of this story if he had not started where he did at the beginning of the story. Joseph never would have endured and been put in the position that God put him in if there was not first some refining in the fire, if you know what I mean. Joseph recognized that God was in control of everything. When Joseph was thrown into a pit by his brothers and they took his robe, they dipped it in blood and told their father he was dead. They sold him to some Ishmaelites who were on their way to Egypt. They sold him into slavery. In that moment, Joseph believed that God was in control. When Joseph was given a place of authority under Potiphar in his house, and Potiphar's wife attacked Joseph and tried to tried to convince him to sleep with her, and Joseph said no and ran away from that temptation and sin. And then Potiphar came back and believed his wife and put Joseph in jail. And as Joseph is in a dark jail cell, he had to believe that God was in control of everything. When Joseph was forgotten about and for years spent time in this prison while others died around him or were freed, he thought he was going to die, but he knew that ultimately God was in control of everything. And then Joseph eventually finds himself as a leader in Egypt, just under Pharaoh, and his own brothers, who sold him into slavery, who essentially killed him for all that it's worth. They forfeited his life. Joseph, standing before them as they need his help, had to understand that God is in control of everything, because if he didn't, he might have reacted in vengeance. Right? Joseph knew that God was in control of all. He understood that stay with me. I don't have that much longer. Stay with me. Joseph knew that every circumstance in his life happened either by God's initiation or with God's permission. Decades later, at the end of Joseph's life, at the end of the story, Joseph acknowledged this conviction that he had to his brothers in Genesis 50 when he said this to his brothers: "You meant it for evil against me, but God meant it for good." That shows the faith that Joseph had in God's sovereignty. He believed that God was for him, not against him. And that conviction helped him to continue pushing forward even when nothing else made sense. Do you believe this morning that, one, God is in control of all, but that God is for you and not against you? Believe that this morning. Number two, we learn from the life of Joseph is this: recognize your responsibility. Viktor Frankl was in the Nazi prison camps of World War II. He was humiliated and tortured and dehumanized, and he made this discovery, and this is what he said: "The last of all great human freedoms is the ability to choose one's response to any given set of circumstances. The easier, more popular route is to use your circumstances as an excuse for personal sin or foolish behavior or the continuing of dysfunctional patterns. Awful things have been done in some of our lives, and the consequences have been hard. Alcoholism, divorce and broken marriages, drug abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. The list goes on and on and on at what some of us have truly endured that has marked us and made us who we are today. And I am not trying at all to belittle the seriousness of these things that we have gone through. But I am simply saying that the phrase, "you don't know what I've been through," for many people has become a launch pad for ugly behavior and for rebellion against God. Joseph did not let himself become a victim. He chose to break the cycle. He took responsibility for a new way of life. When I read that and I ponder that, I think of my own father. My father grew up in a home that was extremely dysfunctional. His dad, my grandfather, who I loved dearly, he was, don't tell anybody this, but he was my favorite grandparent. He spent about 14 years in Huntsville, Texas, at the Walls Unit, which, if you've ever seen it, it's the penitentiary where they put the worst of the worst. My grandfather told me when I was young, he said, "You better be careful who you hang out with." He said, "You better be careful who you hang out with. Your reputation matters." While he was sent to prison, my grandmother moved through various men, became an alcoholic. My father, sorry. I love it when stuff is not in my notes and I begin to share and then I get emotional. My father tells the story of having to tie his mother to the bed so she wouldn't kill herself. Many of you have experienced this type of trauma in your life. One decision that my dad made when he met the Lord as a teenager, he said, I will not allow those patterns to continue in my life. I will not allow for my children to experience what I did. Through that commitment, through that surrendering to the Lord, God not only saved my grandfather, saved my grandmother, who are both in heaven now. God called my father to ministry. He used his life and still does, preaching the gospel. At any moment, there's no doubt that he and others of us could have looked at those experiences and said, you don't know what I've been through, therefore I have an excuse to live my life the way I live it. The chain has to be broken. Decisions have to be made to be committed to God's faithfulness and His goodness. And that ties into our third point. The crazy ways of others doesn't excuse our behavior. Joseph's father did not exactly help Joseph out by telling everybody that Joseph was his favorite. He had 12 brothers. I mean, what happens with brothers when they don't know the Lord, don't follow the Lord? We know what happens. It played out in his life. Joseph's father, Jacob, didn't do any favors there. But here's the thing. Even though Joseph was a product of many of these bad decisions by other people, Joseph knew that he was still responsible for his own actions. Right? He didn't play the victim. Even if you are the victim, don't make that your sole identity. That is not who you are. That is not who God has called you to be. The only people who overcome their past are those who take responsibility for their actions. Some people are handed almost impossible circumstances, and that may explain where you are today or why you have certain patterns of behavior in your life today, but we are still responsible for our behavior, and God will hold us accountable for our behavior in breaking the chain. Number 4 is this: invest in the long game. This is especially important for those of us who are parents to remember. The course of action, the decisions that we make today will affect our children. But not only that, they will affect our grandchildren and even our great-grandchildren. You say, I know I won't be around for my great-grandchildren. You say, I won't be around. Well, first of all, the way that we raise our kids plays out in the way they raise their kids. The habits that are formed, the patterns of behavior that are developed, especially when they go unchecked, always impact the generations after. Jacob's sins and his rebellion, they had long-term effects on his family, and they played out in Joseph's life in a very real way. It's ironic that Jacob stole the birthright from Esau, from his brother, and then Joseph had to endure the wrath of his brothers. There are connections, there are patterns of and actions and behaviors in the life of Jacob that play out in the lives of his children. Invest in the long game. Consider the decisions we make today and how they will play out in the generations that come through and after us. Will this decision make sense in 20 years? Invest in the long game. And the last point is this, and this is something we need to remember for the whole series. God is the hero of the story, not Joseph. We should admire Joseph. We should be amazed at Joseph and his commitment to the things of the Lord and the things that he overcame, but it is God who orchestrated the events in Joseph's life. It is God who brought the purpose into play. It is God who is the hero of this dysfunctional story. And here's the reality. God can absolutely be the hero of your dysfunctional life as well. God can absolutely be the hero in your family's life as well. The question is, are we going to allow where we come from to overcome us, or are we going to overcome where we come from? Hear me out. It isn't fair. Some of the things that some of us have been through is not fair. You remember when you were a kid, and you say, why do I have to do that? And your parents say, life's not fair, right? Life's not fair. Often things that we endure are not fair. But we have two choices. One, we harden against the things of the Lord. We harden our hearts and say, God, you have done this to me. I'm going to live the life I way I want to live it. And we continue in a pattern of brokenness. Or two, we surrender and say, God, I don't know why these things have happened, but I do trust in your goodness and your sovereignty. And I know that the Bible says that you alone are capable and that you are working all things together for good to those that love you. And God, I love you and I surrender and I give you this dysfunction. Speak into it. Give me the purpose that I long for. Help me to break the chains and break the cycles in my life so that I am not overcome where I have come from, by where I've come from, but that I can overcome where I come from. Do you believe that God can do that in your life? He can, because he already has in a lot of your lives. He did it in Joseph's life. In fact, the Bible's full of stories of dysfunction and brokenness that God speaks into and uses not only for his glory, but for the good and the betterment of the people that moved through the brokenness. That is what God can and wants to do in your life. Just give it to him. Bow your heads and close your eyes for just a moment. I want us to spend a moment in prayer. And I don't know your situation. I don't know if you're here today and maybe things that were said were speaking directly into your experiences. I don't know that. God does. God knows what you've been through. He knows what you're in the middle of right now. In all of this today, you need to understand, it is in the form of an invitation, not judgment. We all come from brokenness. We all are sinful people. It's not a matter of some of us being good and not. We're not. None of us are. We all come from brokenness. The key is, what am I going to do with my brokenness while I'm in it? Am I going to give it to the Lord? Am I going to make an effort to break the cycle, to change behavior, to surrender to the things of God? Or am I going to continue in the path and just hope that it's not so detrimental to my family that I don't regret it?